So the context of this public lecture is in fact a workshop that has been convened today, and it goes on until tomorrow morning. It's really a first preparatory lecture discussion with a view to convening a series of workshops come conferences on the study of Nabati poetry, which is something we read quite a lot about in the newspapers, but really the proper academic science at Nabati poetry hasn't really received its just attention, and so we're trying to contribute to putting that right, if I can say modestly. But that will be explained, I think, during the course of the evening. Let me just say that, let me introduce our speakers and get on with it. Dr. Sowayan is professor at King Saud University, where he's an anthropologist in the main. It's his main discipline, but he's also a student of the Middle East and comparative literature. That is to say, he got his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, in anthropology, Middle Eastern studies, and comp literature. His PhD was published as a brilliant book in 1985 titled Nabati Poetry, The Oral Poetry of Arabia, which was published by University of California Press. And in my view, and I teach Arabic literature, and really with an emphasis on pre-modern classical Arabic literature and poetry, I think it's one of the handful of books, the books that one can count in one hand that every student of Arabic should read, even though it seems to be about the late pre-modern period. It really is an extremely important book to understand classical Arabic poetry, which is, of course, the source of all Arabic literature. What happened with pre-Islamic poetry, of course, is that it became urbanized. The history of Arabic literature is that the Bedouin poetry of the pre-Islamic poets, the poets of the Mu'allaqat, became urbanized with that in the great glory days of the Abbasids, with poets like Abu Nuwas and Ibn al-Mu'taz and Abu Tamam and al-Buhtari, borrowing desert themes, but themselves they were not Bedouin. And the themes that were developed by the Abbasids continued very much, developed to some extent through the Mamluk period into the early modern period, and to some extent they were revived by the neoclassicists at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. However, the Bedouin poetry of the pre-Islamic greats, Ibn al-Qais, Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma, and the rest of that great cohort of poets really disappeared, as it were, from history into the desert, but reemerges to some extent in the writing of Saad Sowayan and in the tradition which he studied. So that is why it's such an important book. It shows the links between the poetry of oral poetry and traditions of 18th century Central Arabia and that great pre-Islamic tradition. I don't want to go on, so let me just say that in 1991 he published the Arabian Oral Narratives, an ethnographic and linguistic analysis, which is a brilliant book also. His recordings of oral traditions and poetry of Najd are a unique scholarly resource and treasure, and really he really is the doyen of the study of much of the oral traditions, both poetic and narrative of Central Arabia, of the Najd. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of his work, let me say. So I move to our second guest, who will, Dr. Sowayan will lecture for half an hour or so, and after that, Marcel Kurpershoek will address a few words to the paper, and they will then engage in a Q&A, perhaps discuss among themselves, but do a Q&A with the audience, and then there will be some readings right at the end. So Marcel Kurpershoek is an Arabist, a scholar, and a diplomat, a Dutch diplomat, let me say. And until last summer, he was a Dutch ambassador in Poland. But in the 1980s, he was posted in Saudi Arabia, where he became fascinated with the oral poetry of the Bedouin and semi-nomadic tribes. And he has published several studies on the subject, including the multi-volumed work titled Oral Poetry and Narratives from Central Arabia, and another book entitled Arabia of the Bedouins, which is more of a sort of travelogue and reflections. He's a brilliant scholar in his own right, and most of the Arabists that I know are quite in awe of the fact that he's both a diplomat and such a productive and brilliant scholar. So please welcome our guests, and first of all, Dr. Sowayan to the podium.
Tonight, I will beg your indulgence, for I'm going to throw caution to the wind and speak up my mind and tell it like I think it is. I'm going to start my presentation by drawing some comparisons between Nabati poetry and Greek literature, as well as giving a few examples from ancient Near Eastern culture. And I'm going to slightly tip the balance intentionally in favor of Nabati poetry. I say intentionally because my purpose is to make certain claims with the greatest emphasis possible. I'm going to claim that if we were to compare Nabati poetry and Greek literature, Nabati poetry wouldn't come out the worst off than Greek literature if it were not for the sophisticated analytical tools which have been utilized throughout the ages to hammer out the best there is in Greek literature and to add to it luster, brilliance, and coherence that would be otherwise lacking. How much ink has been spilt by brilliant classicists and Renaissance scholars on studying Homeric epics, or Hesiod, Theogony, or Pindar, or Sappho, the poetess of Lesbos. Since the Renaissance, this has been an ongoing scholarly undertaking that verges on indoctrination, not to say infatuation, undertaking no less emphatic, not to say fanatic, than Bible Sunday lessons. It is this inherent bias in Western scholarship that make of the Greek concept Moira a concept loaded with profound philosophical significance, while the very exact Arab concept of qisma, nasib, is a mere indicative of fatalism. Greek culture was enthusiastically adopted by European elites as their cultural ancestor, and an attitude which reminds us somewhat of that adopted by Arab intellectuals towards the Jahili era. Both were breeze. Greek was pre-Christian and Jahiliyyah was pre-Islamic. To clarify my intention, I can only give a few simple examples, keeping in mind that I'm talking here not so much about Nabati verse or Greek verse. Rather, I'm talking about the whole tradition, meaning the whole encompassing culture milieu of each one of these poetic traditions, including myths and legends, and in the case of Nabati poetry, the narrative suwalif, usually associated with the poem. It would be too tedious to compare Nabati poetry and Greek poetry image for image and topos for topos. There is hardly a heroic scene in the Iliad, for example, which has no parallel in Nabati tradition. Since each one of these two poetic traditions is a reflection of its general cultural ambience, and heroic ethics, it would be more enlightening and parsimonious to compare these cultural settings. I am calling for a shift in emphasis from the purely literary criticism to the more comprehensive cultural criticism. This would provide us with the leeway to bring in other adjectives, to bring in other adjacent and relevant traditions comprising the totality of the ancient civilization of the Near East. We can widen the comparative scope to include Sumerian, Egyptian, Semitic cultures, and other cultures. Let me start with the opening lines of a Nabati poem. The Nabati poet usually starts his verses by telling us that when he is overcome by the compositional mood, he enters into an altered state of mind, into a trance resembling the trance of the Pythia, the prophetess of Apollo and at Delphi, when she delivers her prophetic oracles and inspired ravings. The Greek word for such a prophetess is mantis, a word related in etymology to mania or madness. The Nabati poet tells us literally that he goes mad. When he feels the urge to compose, he seeks solitude away from the crowd, so people would not see him in such a disarrayed state and untidy appearance. He usually seeks the promontory of a high mountain, the image of scaling a mountain summit. The image of scaling a mountain summit collapses two ideas: the idea of the difficulty of compositional labor and the idea of widening horizons that allow the poet to see from higher up further than ordinary mortals can see. What concerns us here is the fact that ancient Greeks and Semites always sought mountaintops to be close to the gods and to the sources of inspiration. Babylonians, whose country was flat, built ziggurats, ziggurats, or what is conventionally dubbed as Tower of Babel. Here, we should remember that Moses received the Ten Commandments on the top of Mount Horeb. Related to the theme of poetic composition is the description of mental toil of the poet in his search for beautiful images, and comparing it on the one hand to the mental anguish of the lover yearning for his lady, or on the other to the arduous toil of the hunter after the quarry, sometimes running barefoot on rocks and thistles, and sometimes crawling on his hands and knees. In the opening lines of his poem, the poet hunter would tell us that he was waiting in his hiding place for the game to pass by with gun loaded, but as he was aiming and ready to shoot, the beautiful eyes and graceful neck of the gazelle reminded him of his amour, so he did not shoot. Here, we find the reminiscence of legends related to the Greek Artemis, Diana of the Romans, the virgin goddess of the hunt. We may take the hunter's refrain from shooting his quarry as a propitiation for the goddess of the hunt and respect for her virginity, since both killing a game and violating chastity involves the shedding of blood. The legend says that the hunter Actaeon glanced at Diana while she was dipping naked in the lake. As punishment, she transformed him into a gazelle, and he was hunted down by his own hunting dogs. Glancing at naked lasses in a pool is a favorite theme in Arabic poetry, from the classical poet Imru al-Qais to the Nabati poet Jabr ibn Sayyar. Some of you may remember the encounter of the Trojan chief Anchises with Aphrodite. The goddess Aphrodite was enamored with Anchises, and she wanted him to sleep with her. A lucky man he was to be desired by the very goddess of sexual passion. Poor Anchises was stunned and overwhelmed by the glory of the deity, and he beseeched her to leave him be and not to molest him, promising her if she spared him, he would offer a sacrifice for her every year and will build her a sanctuary on the top of the highest mountain, which would be seen from afar in all directions. Since Al-Jahiliyyah, till recent times, Bedouins used to raise a white flag and build a cairn of white boulders on a high mountain or high roads or near watering wells, announcing the favor done by someone to someone else. This is called bayab, whitening. On the other hand, blackening, Saud, is done to blacken the name of a treacherous or a dishonest man. The camel brand of the intended man is scratched on the white or black kern. Excuse me, I am a bit hot here. Yeah. I am sure you all know Hermes, the Greek god, clever son of Zeus. On the very day he was born, he stole the cattle of his brother Apollo. To deceive Apollo, Hermes wore his sandals backwards, turned them around, so when he is going, it looks like he is coming. This is the very trick resorted to, according to legend, of course, by Ghalib ibn Hattab, the poet chief of Al-Jawf district when he escaped from the prison of Ibn Rashid in Hayil. In the narrative background of the poem, the Sharif Barakat, the story goes that his mother-in-law was infatuated by him, but he rebuffed her advances. She skinned a desert rat, Jarbu', and threw it in the majlis of his father, claiming that his son tried to sexually assault her, and while defending her honor, she dropped her fetus. The father chastised his son and told him never to show his face in his majlis. The same thing happened with the Greek hero Hippolytus. Hippolytus was willing to kneel for the goddess Artemis, but not to Aphrodite. Aphrodite was crossed with him and caused Phaedra, the wife of Hippolytus' father, Theseus, to have a crush on him. Hippolytus suffered the same fate as Sharif Barakat. Or is it the other way around, of course? Another Greek legend says that Hecate, the wife of Priam, king of Troy, while pregnant with her son Paris, dreamed that she was giving birth to a blaze of fire that burned everything. Of course, we know that Paris caused the Trojan War when he kidnapped Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Mycenae. The incident reappears with one chiefly lady from the tribe of Al-Ijman, who is said to have dreamed the same dream and married Sultan al-Duwish, the Mutair chief, whose incessant raids on Al-Ijman cost them dearly. The heroic values of Nabati tradition coincide with those of Greek tradition. Both traditions assert that only heroes deserve fat meat, fair ladies, and sitting on carpets and cushions, soft cushions, and not on bare, dusty earth. Both traditions have the same concepts of honor, renown, or glory, kleos in Greek. A common theme in Homer's epics, kleos is a common theme in Homer's epics, especially in the episodes of the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon. You achieve honor and glory by performing outstanding heroic feats that would cluster into a biographical narrative or salva and poems that people will continue retelling long after you are dead, thus causing your name to be immortalized and your memory to be preserved many generations after you die. Such deeds would enhance the reputation and social status of your progeny and hold them responsible to preserve the honor you have bestowed on them and living up to it. This is the only immortality you can achieve in Nabati and Greek traditions. There is no hereafter. Let's now change direction and go from Greece to the ancient Near East. We will start with the ancient Sumerians. They are called the black-headed people, Sudan al-Rus. This is the very epithet designating the Shammara tribe, and what makes this parallel significant is the very close relationship of Shammar to Mesopotamia and the continuous waves of migration since very ancient times from northern Arabia to Mesopotamia. Take another example. I remember as a young boy when farmers tilled the land for planting corn, they used to sing, Ya wali yassama taj'ala athiri, meaning, Lord of the sky, may you grant that our corn would grow luxurious. Is not athiri derived from Ishtar or Ithar, goddess of fertility? Also, isn't Lord of the sky a fitting title for Zeus? I also remember that the cornfields planted in the open desert to be irrigated by rain were called Baal. I don't need to remind you who Baal is. There is no end to such cultural parallels between Nabati traditions and ancient Semitic beliefs. Take tree worship, especially the palm tree. Before the Wahhabi movement in Najd, an unmarried woman used to circumambulate around the male palm tree while repeating, Ya fahla al-fuhul, uridu ba'lan qabla al-hawl, asking this palm tree for that she would be pregnant. Remnants of tree worship does not stop here. The Najdis used to put blades from the fronds of a palm tree on exposed food or milk, believing that such a precautionary measure would protect the food from poisoning. In the Najdi version of the Hilali epic, the Hilali epic has many versions. In the Najdi version, the hero Abu Zayd was traveling with his nephew Aziz, and Aziz died on the way back home. After burying him, Abu Zayd tethered his camel, left his ring, and cut his hair on his nephew's grave. Do not tell me that this is not a reverberation of grave offerings. Should I also remind you of Al-Utfa, also called Al-Markab or Al-Dhulla? This is a gigantic, decorated riding gear like a hoda, with a young chiefly lady inside, nearly naked, and ululating to encourage her tribal folks on the battlefield. Could Al-Markab be a remnant of the ancient Semitic tabernacle, and the ululating lady a remnant of Athene or Ishtar, both deities of war and love among their other duties, of course? Or take the Nabati epithet Al-Adhara. This epithet does not mean virgin in Nabati tradition. Virgin is Bikr, not Adhra. Adhra simply means fair young lady, and I always wondered what light this could shed on the epithet Maryam al-Adhra, which is translated as the Virgin Mary. Now I want to say a few words about customary law. Let me first point out that each Bedouin tribe usually set apart one of its branches to be a refuge for the accused and the transgressors till they get a fair trial. We find the same institution recorded in chapter 20 of Joshua and Exodus. In customary law among the Bedouin, most procedures relating to confirmation of oaths have to do with sexual organs and fertility symbols, like the oath of Shamla and the oath of Namla. Shamla is a kind of bracery, a cloth put on the udders of a female camel in milk so her young does not suckle all her milk, and some would be left for the family nourishment. Namla is the ant, and ants, of course, come out during harvest season. Connection with fertility in these two cases should be apparent. On the other hand, when someone is in distress and seeks the help and protection of a stronger man, he holds the belt of this benefactor while seeking his help. I take the belt here as euphemism for the phallus, the instrument of fertility. This should remind you of the story of Abraham with his servant whom he entrusted to send to the land of Haran to ask for the hand of Rivka, daughter of Betuel, for his son Isaac. Abraham asked the servant to put his hand on his, that is Abraham's thigh, and swear that he will seek a wife for Isaac from Haran and not from the Canaanites. Again, I take Abraham's thigh as euphemism for his penis. When the servant arrived to the home of Laban, son of Nahor, he refused to partake of the food they offered him till they hear him out first and grant him his request, i.e. the hand of Rivka for Isaac. This is the Bedouins' ritual of mumalaha. Among them, an emissary will not taste even water or coffee till his request is granted. This ritual is related to the bond of hospitality, or what the ancient Greeks call zinaya, whereby a guest enters into a bond with his host, and neither of them is supposed to molest or cause harm to the other. The institution of zinaya is demonstrated by the incident of the encounter of two Homeric heroes, Glaucus and Diomedes, on the battlefield of Troy. Although the two heroes were fighting on opposite sides, when they met, they refrained from killing each other when they discovered that they were bound by the Xenia bond, a bond that they inherited from their ancestors. Violation of Zinaya is demonstrated by the unseemly conduct of the suitors who wanted to marry Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, thinking that he would never return from Troy. Traces of this institution can be detected in the story of Lot, as recorded in the 19th chapter of Genesis. Lot begged the people of Sodom not to molest the two angels because they were his guests under his roof. We are all familiar with the expression Mother Earth. The earth is pictured in ancient culture as a goddess called Ga, or Gaia by the Greeks. Nabati poets use two epithets to refer to the homeland, the earth, the land. Al-Oni, in his poem Al-Khaluj, called it our mother, how sweet is her milk. Poets who composed panegyrics praising the late King Abdulaziz and lauding his efforts to unify the kingdom called Najd a beautiful young bride whose dowry is gunpowder and drawn swords. On the other hand, chiefs, kings, and pharaohs in ancient societies are depicted in the image of a bull, the bull being a symbol of brute force and insatiable sexual virility, and hence fertility and prosperity. It is the responsibility of the king or pharaoh to fertilize the land and to defend it against enemy intruders. Let me dwell a bit on the image of the bull, which goes as far back in history as the drawing on the palette of Narmer, the first Egyptian pharaoh, not to mention testimonies from Mesopotamian archaeology. In Nabati poetry, the advancing brave warriors on the battlefield are compared to the charge of camel bulls in heat, for it is impossible to stand in the way of a rutting bull from his advances towards a female camel in heat. Keep in mind also the bitch battles between male animals and the rutting season. Should a chief of a Najdi settlement be besieged by his enemies, he feigns marriage and orders his men to beat the drums in celebration of his wedding to show the enemy that his sexual appetite is at its peak, and thus the siege does not worry him in the least. Here we see the link between sexual virility and courage in war. One of the most interesting examples illustrating this theme is a poem by the Shammari poet Khalaf Buzwayid praising Sattam ibn Sha'lan, chief of the Rwala tribe. For a reason we do not need to go into, Khalaf Buzwayid fell from grace at the court of Prince Muhammad ibn Rashid and sought refuge with Sattam ibn Sha'lan. Ibn Rashid was barren and had no children, so Abu Zwayid insinuated at this in his poem, while at the same time comparing Ibn Sha'lan, the traditional enemy of Ibn Rashid, to a stud horse. The court poets of Ibn Rashid, took this as a very grave offense and composed many poems defending the virility of their prince. If in this talk I sound to you like I'm rambling, it is because the points of contact between Nabati tradition and the ancient traditions I mentioned are so vast, varied, and variegated. It is hard to pin them down and get a good grip on them. There are many more examples to cite, but it would take long-winded explanations and detailed background information to point out the resemblance. My aim was only to give few examples in order to draw your attention to parallelism between Nabati poetry and ancient Greek and ancient Near Eastern traditions, and then proceed from there to state that by carefully studying Nabati poetry and comparing it with these ancient traditions, we can shed light on them, these traditions, just as much as we shed light on Nabati poetry itself. Furthermore, such parallelism entitle us to benefit from the research tools which have been applied since the European Renaissance to analyze these ancient traditions and utilize them in our study of Nabati poetry. We need all the sophisticated tools, scientific tools applied to the study of the folklore, oral literature, and oral history of all nations, especially those applied to the study of ancient Near Eastern, Egyptian, Semitic, and Greek cultures and literatures. I wanted to show that this poetry is no less valuable and worthy of our attention than other traditions which are deemed important by specialists. It is time to start treating Nabati poetry with the same scholarly seriousness in which we treat these ancient traditions. Studying Nabati poetry within strictly local limits is not very illuminating. Such an approach undermines the real value of Nabati poetry. So far, I have been dwelling on the comparative approach as one of the research tools we need to utilize in the study of Nabati poetry, but we need also the scientific armaments we can muster, and here I want to stress the importance of the holistic approach, which emphasizes the connectedness of literature to the rest of culture in oral societies. Oral literature is embedded and enmeshed with the rest of culture and traditional societies. Therefore, literary criticism and exegesis turn out to be not just philological and literary, but mainly ethnographic. In studying the total cultural ambience of an oral literary text, such as a Nabati poem, we come to understand fully not only its content and meaning, but also its function, which is usually not strictly artistic and aesthetic, as it is the case in the literary text of script culture. A poem composed by a Bedouin sheikh is not just a poem. It would be considered frivolous and unbecoming for a respectable sheikh to compose a poem just for its own sake. And sheikhs usually open their poems with such a disavowal. It has to have a dignified purpose and serious intent to defend the cause, lay a claim, exhort to action, declare war, celebrate a victory, sue for peace, and so forth. Let me sum up my position. Oral literature is, in a sense, like a crude oil, in that there are so many derivatives you can extract from it, but only if you have good refineries. In this case, in the present instance, this means sound methodological tools and sophisticated theoretical orientation. This way, if you do not enjoy oral tradition as art, you can utilize it, for example, as a historical document reflecting or refracting social facts. If we agree that Nabati poetry is a reflection of Arabian culture, then its interpretation becomes not merely a linguistic or literary undertaking, it becomes a comprehensive ethnographic project. For to deal with the themes, imageries, and the whole content of Nabati poetry is to deal with the cultural components of the Arabian culture in its totality. At this level of analysis, Nabati poetry and classical Arabic poetry interlock and interact to give us a comprehensive, continuous ethnographic portrayal of the Arabian culture from pre-Islamic era to pre-modern times. Just as Nabati poetry is the natural continuation of Jahili poetry, so the pre-modern culture of Arabia is the continuation of its classical predecessor. Therefore, as much as we call for the study of Nabati poetry for a deeper understanding of pre-Islamic poetry, we also just as urgently call for the study of the culture of pre-modern Arabia to shed light on aspects of the pre-Islamic era which are still hidden from us. This way, we can fill the gaps in our knowledge of earlier times. Furthermore, we should remember that the Arabian Peninsula is the original home from which all Semitic races migrated since ancient times, and that Bedouin culture is the prototype of ancient Semitic culture. Therefore, Bedouin ethnography holds the key to a deeper comprehension of pre-Islamic Arabia as well as ancient Semitic society, religion, and customs. In this talk, my intent was to look at Nabati poetry from a wider perspective and to treat it with the seriousness it deserves as a potent social, political, and ideological force in the traditional Arabian society. More specifically, there must be a stop to studying Nabati poetry by the wrong people, for the wrong reasons, using the wrong tools. We need to upgrade the study of this heritage from the anecdotal to the scholarly. We might as well amend the subtitle of this talk and change it from Studying Nabati Poetry, Tools of the Trade, to become Studying Nabati Poetry, a Plea for Method. Thank you very much.
Allah yabayid wajhak. You know this expression? It means, may God whiten your face. And you say that when you are very much indebted to someone who has just done something out of the extraordinary. And we could also start to erect a regime on top of this building. You know, there's a cairn of stones. If you want to honor someone, you build a cairn of stones on top of a hill, and you put a white flag on it, and you say, well, this is for Saad. And you really, you really deserve it. It's not madih, you know, it's not the poetic praise, but it's just a matter of fact that you have done more for this field of study than anyone else. And perhaps we are meeting here, we're on the point of on the verge of maybe a new discipline in Arabic studies, and I think the Emirates is the right place for this because of you know, things, initiatives like Sha'r al-Milyon, and the classical side of it, Amir al-Shura, the prince of poets. Sha'r al-Milyon is the millionth poet, of course. On this, the tools of the trade. I think that, well, I'm for sure, you started from the anthropology side. Your approach was from that angle. But for me, I think the main thing is not so much discipline, but attitude. And you really combine the spirit of scholarship, but also of adventure. And I've known Saad for, I don't know how long, like 30 years, from the time I served in Riyadh. real curiosity, real scientific curiosity. So I was thinking, what does it call to my mind? And you mentioned the poet who climbs on a mountain and then seeks inspiration. And to me, you seem like someone who has his base camp in a valley, and then he goes in that direction in the mountains, and that direction, and then you come back in your base camp and you compare all your knowledge and experience, and you come up with very surprising conclusions, as you did today, actually, by connecting Arabian poetry and folk culture with classical Greek and Middle Eastern cultures, and showing that it is all, that are actually many things which are comparable. I want to add to that I've always been so impressed by your knowledge of classical Arabic literature as well. And I feel you did not do that as a pastime, but you were always going into the classical literature looking for something, you know. You really wanted to learn from it, and like you needed their experience and wisdom. And well, it's 1,000 years ago, let's say, but you know, that's a period that's no obstacle for you. And it reminds me that one of your works you dedicated to the critic Abu Ubaidah, right? And I think here you are a modern Abu Ubaidah. I don't know, that is my idea. And then I put to myself the question, how would Abu Ubaidah define this discipline to which he belonged? And I think, I cannot speak for Abu Ubaidah, but I think Abu Ubaidah, he would not care a hoot about or think about disciplines. You know, what he cared about was the Diwan al-Arab, the register of the Arabs you mentioned. And he just wanted to collect and to explain and to understand. And he took whatever he could find to reach that purpose. So history, language, geography, religion, genealogy, tribal lore, and I should also add, like you, his humanistic nature and sense of humor. So the study of Nabati poetry, for me, it brings the classical heritage. Sometimes it can seem to some people maybe, you know, a little bit distant or hard to understand or arid, but studying Nabati poetry, for me also, it has brought the classical heritage to life. It helps us understand that heritage, and it brings it closer to our interest today. But also the opposite, the heritage also helps us understand the world of Nabati poetry. So just to end by repeating the words of a poet, Ibn Sbayl, to the ruler of Hayl, which you mentioned, Muhammad ibn Rashid, شجاع تورخ بالأماكن فعايلة ثم ورخوا للسلف الأول فعايل. I will translate this into English. A brave man whose deeds are chronicled far and wide, as the Arabs' register, Diwan al-Arab, was preserved as our guide. Thank you so much, Saad.
Okay, I have a question. I grew up in Egypt, so I was not very familiar with Nabati poetry. So what was the reason that Nabati poetry continued to grow and flourish side by side with classical Arabic poetry?
You answer this.
No, this is your question.
What was
you
the
wrote
question?
the book Nabati Poetry, right?
You mean how come the Nabati poetry and the classical poetry thrive side by side? Well, Nabati poetry is actually the composed and the spoken language of the age, and language changes if you don't have schools to teach people grammar of the classical language so they can learn it and start speaking classical Fusha, then they will respond to these linguistic changes, so their speech will change and accordingly their poetry will change. Yet, in urban, we are talking about rural areas here, in urban areas where there are schools, grammar schools, people learn classical Arabic, so they are able to compose in the classical idiom.
الشعر العربي هو شعر التفعيلة الكلاسيكي. هل الشعر النبطي يحوي أي أوزان ولا هو شعر مثل الشعر الحديث؟ كيف كان الشعراء يقيسوا هذا الشعر النبطي؟
أنت تسأل عن أوزان الشعر النبطي. طبعا له أوزان لأنه شعر مغنى، وأوزانه تعتمد أو تنطلق من أوزان الشعر العربي الكلاسيكي، لكن بما أن النظام المقطعي للغة تغير والوزن يقوم على النظام المقطعي، إذن تغيرت بعض الأوزان استجابة لهذا التغير المقطعي. ثم إن شعراء النبط، طبعا الأوزان نحن مشكلتنا في اللغة العربية حينما نقعد شيء نعتقد أنه فاينل خلاص لا بد أن يستمر على هذا الشكل، لكن العامة لا يعرفون هذا الشيء فهم يستجيبون لسلقتهم، ولذلك كانت لهم الحرية ليخترعوا أوزانا جديدة على خلاف الشعراء الكلاسيكيين الذين تقيدوا بأوزان الخليل.
عندما سئل بدوي الجبل هل تنظم أبياتك على التفعيلات؟ قال لا، التفعيلات أو البحور تنتظم على أبياتي.
كيف؟
عندما سئل بدوي الجبل هل ترتب أبياتك، هل تنظم شعرك وفقا لبحور الشعر؟ رد بدوي الجبل وقال لا، بحور الشعر تنتظم لأبياتي. كيف نرى ذلك مع الشعر النبطي؟ لا يوجد أوزان، لا يوجد، هل هو شعر تفعيلة أو هو شعر فقط حديث لا وزن له؟ وما هي أهم دعني أقول أهم themes أو أهم موضوعات الشعر النبطي؟
سؤال كبير هذا. كل الحياة هي موضوع الشعر النبطي. الحياة أكبر من أن نستوعبها في كلمات قليلة أقولها لك الآن. فأي موضوع يخطر على بالك يمكن أن يكون موضوع قصيدة في الشعر النبطي، لكن أيضا هنالك المواضيع التقليدية مثل المدح والهجاء والغزل والفخر والحكمة، وكل هذه الأشياء موجودة. أما الوزن فهو موزون، لأن كل أبيات القصيدة تنتظم على نفس التفعيلة بصرف ما يقول بدوي الجبل هو حر فيما يقول، لكن أنا أتكلم لك عن الشعر النبطي. الشعر النبطي له أوزان، نعم أوزانه كثيرة ومفتوحة، والمجال أيضا مفتوح للاختراع، اختراع أوزان جديدة، لأنه مرة أخرى لم يتقيد ببحور الخليل كأشياء ينبغي التقيد بها مثل ما عمل شعراء الفصحى. شعراء الفصحى قيدوا أنفسهم ببحور الخليل، ولكن لو لم يقيدوا أنفسهم لكان هنالك مجال للاختراع، والشعر الغنائي ربما خرج عن بحور الخليل ببحور جديدة مختلفة.
Thank you very much. I was fascinated by how you began your lecture calling for a comparative approach to Nabati poetry, and of course comparing that to Greek literature, pointing out similarities, parallels in terms of imagery, motifs, and so forth. And then you ended your lecture stressing the anthropological value of studying Nabati poetry as a way of understanding Bedouin society today. So, and of course, with an anthropological approach, we are concerned only with a particular society, looking at it from the inside. So I was wondering if you can elaborate on the methodology that you're advocating, the comparative approach and the anthropological approach.
One I call the comparative approach, and one I call the comprehensive, multidimensional approach. There are so many approaches. I'm just giving examples of the approaches that we can apply to studying and understanding Nabati poetry. You could either, it is like you can either go horizontally, or you can go vertically, or you can go in any, however you slice it, it is there, and you should use as many approaches as you can, because this way you can deepen and widen your understanding of this poetry. And I intended to compare it to other traditions to show the connections, and also to show that it is no less important than these other traditions, and there are ambiguities in these traditions, and perhaps we can solve these ambiguities by resorting to Nabati poetry, which is more immediate, more recent, more close to us, and the other way around.
You mentioned something about a word no longer having meaning, and that it's used just to keep a meter. So I was just curious to hear like maybe one or two more examples of how things have changed with this poetry, just like over time. Like if you don't mind sharing like something else that has changed.
Okay, you want to answer this?
Shall I do it with a poem, or maybe a short one? Yeah. But a short answer maybe to your question is mal. You know the word mal? Now it means money. Before it means camels. Yeah. On the examples of poetry, there was a question on that. What subjects is this poetry dealing with? And what I have here, it's a collection of poetry on football, for instance. It can deal with the subject. The title is قصائص حب على صدر المنتخب. Love poems for the national soccer team. So that, there is a lot of similarities actually between the football poetry and old tribal mufakhara. But the example I want to give you it's different. It's a very short love poem by a poet whose name is Ad-Dindan. And it means, Dindan, Dendan, Yedendin. He was always singing to himself, like songs on the camel, composing poems. So it's more a laqab, not a real name, but everyone knew him as Ad-Dindan. And I lived with him in Arabia, in the central Arabia for a couple of months, and I recorded his poetry. And he was illiterate Bedouin who only cared about his camels and tribe and poetry. He was a very good poet. Unfortunately, he passed away. I took from his work, which at that time was not published, and especially this poem not. So this poem was about something that happened to him when he was on pilgrimage in Mecca. And, usually a poem, it has a selfa, a short story to explain the occasion of this poem, why it was said. So I asked always Dindan, what is the occasion for this Shul Munasba? What is the occasion for this poem? And then he said, well, I was in Mecca and I was walking around the Kaaba, and then a woman called my name. And she wanted me to help her push through the crowd. There were so many people. It was uncomfortable for her. So Dinsan said it was innocent, And then I said, because, you know, if someone there in the desert, they start to tell a poem, they just don't say, no, I will declaim or say, I just said, you know, it is call, say, words. So I said, oh God, I translated into English. I don't have the Arabic version with me now. Oh God, I trust you to protect me from the lady who is calling me, forcing me to answer her between the pillars, the maqam and the colonnade. I swear, I did not go looking for her. I kept my distance. May the clouds not release their rain on their tribal land. I felt fine till she crossed my path and then started my misery. My heart is heavy on her account, but I kept it hidden for fear a clever fellow might discover my secret. If not for shame, I had ripped off my pilgrim cloth, walking naked among pilgrims seeking forgiveness. Never again in my life visits to her tent, or even look at her until death closes my eyes. Why did I not seek her out during Bayram festivities, before their camel train headed north and dispersed? So then he stopped this poem at this point. I didn't then. But the people around him, oh, there's another, well, they said, come on, Dindan, there was one more verse. He said, no, there was no more verse. I said, no, there was one more verse. Come on, give it to us. And then finally, you know, he started giggling and said, okay, this is the first. How I wish I had kissed her when we met and buried my arms in her brown, luxurious hair.
You think this is outrageous. Wait until you hear this. Actually, my friend Marcel is a diplomat, so he has his quyut. He is tethered, but I am retired, so I can't be outrageous. I'm going to read you a poem by Medan Ashwer about getting old and decrepit. Maidan thrived and lived in the 18th century when Central Arabia was divided into warring tribes and independent small city-states ruled by tyrants. Maidan's poetry reflects this state of political turmoil and social instability. His scathing attacks were directed against heavy-handed tyrants, incompetent rulers, moneylenders, and biased judges who tipped the balance of justice in favor of the aristocrats, calling them bribes devouring lords, thus repeating the same epithet used by the Greek poet Hesiod in his works and days. In one famous line, he compared judges to barbers. They cut the hair of an aristocrat using a very sharp razor while using a grass cutter to share the hair of the poor. His poetry can be classified as black comedy. His language is not that sublime poetic language. It is street language. Sublime poetic language won't work for effective comedy. His meters, language, thematic structure are all his own. On the socio-political level, everything around him seemed to be in flux. This colored his poetic outlook with a philosophy of fatalism. From this sample I am about to read to you, you can easily detect his comic style, which is a thin veneer glossing over a dead seriousness, and a thoroughgoing fatalism. I am choosing this poet and this poem in particular because I wanted to treat with you a less trodden tracks in Nabati poetry to treat with you illustrated tracts in Nabati poetry and take a respite from the serious themes of romance and heroism. Here is the poem. Verily, Mnif, my friend, has warned me. He told me that only youths in their prime, are treated with respect. As man gets old, he is despised even by his children and by the mother of his children. If he were just to ask them for a bite to chew on, they would holler in unison, "Away with you, gypsy." After he had squandered his wealth on them, they would deny that they owed him anything, while before they were at his pick and call. Mnif told me also, spare your fortune if you want to maintain their respect and to have them rush to meet you at the threshold. I did not pay heed to Mnif's words then, but now the hidden has been revealed. In their old age, some men are addressed, "Yes, sir." Some are addressed, "What in the hell do you want?" Even the mother of my children can't stand me anymore. She forgot all those passionate times we had together. She misses that which I dare not mention. When we used to do it, me kneeling on my knees and the tips of my toes. Then it could harden like a driving stick. But now look at it, dangling below my rectum. Would that it could be bought, I would surely buy it. I would pay all my fortune in gold. Look at me now. My bones are aching and my back is stiff below the belt. At night, creep thoughts disturb my sleep. Fear of death seeking me haunts me every night. Every construction in this world ends up in destruction. I tell you, it is a hopeless pursuit. As for me, I am closing shop and signing off. I am leaving my place in this world to whomsoever wishes to take it. بلعون قسم زي والله العظيم ولا بلعون منيفن his friend منيف بلعون منيفن قال أهلي يقول غلاك يوم انتصبي ترى الشايب عند عياله وام عياله مثل الصلبي ترى الشايب عند عياله وام عياله مثل العزبي لو يطلبهم ردت لقمة قالوا مخلي وش هالصلبي كلوا فيدو حلاله ماله كلوا فيدو وجحدوه عقبة تمسك بس ببي احفظ مالك تجي غالي حتى يلاجونك بالعتبي وتذبت منيفين في قوله وتبين لي ما كان غبي احدني قال له لبيك واحدني قال له وش تبي حتى ام عيالي زهدت بي نسيت زماني وطربي فقدت مني شن مطريه على بهمي وعلى ركبي يوم في يدي مثل الشوحط واليوم دلة ورا ذنبي لو هو يشرى كان اشريه وارخص به مالي وذهبي اشوف عظامي توجعني وظهيري من حد حقبي وهجوسي تسري بالليل خوفي من موت بطلبي الدنيا عامرها دامر ما فيها خير يعربي صدرت وطويت العده ويعذبني من كان يبي